Hi all, thanks for staying. Welcome back after the last break of today's conference. You can already see my slides up there. I would like to share a few thoughts on open access and especially on the gaps of open access, which I have come across over the last months, I would say. Forgive me if I don't react to any questions or comments in the chat over the next 30 to 40 minutes because I'm just seeing the full screen now so that you can see as much as possible. I'll turn off my camera and let me start by saying that it's kind of difficult to talk about open access after today and yesterday because my colleagues have already, I think, given you a lot of hints, a lot of details and ways of looking at open access. As I said, I would like to focus a little bit from where we are, and I think that is pretty consensual in most dimensions. And I would like to focus on 4 gaps I see from my work, basically. And then try a few hypotheses for our discussion afterwards where we might go from here in open access. And I am aware, I myself are giving presentations on open access, speaking on it since 12 or 14 years. And I'm still every year again surprised by the turns and twists open access and open science in general and take. But let's go back to these slides in 2 or 3 years from now and see whether they had any value in answering the questions. So where are we? I've compiled a few numbers for you from Delta Think in this case, and from a more commercial perspective on purpose. You can see that Delta Think assumes and says that the open access share in billion US dollars in revenue is 850 million. And obviously this is only referring to gold open access, paid open access, and not to green. We see still quite significant growth from 763 million US dollars last year to 850 million. And obviously the number of articles which are now globally at a share of 30% open access and 70% closed access, paywalled access, can be matched with 7% in revenues from open access and 93 publisher revenue, 93% from closed access. At the same time, we see that while paywalled business and paywalled content is obviously still prevailing for almost all publishers, of course, except for those that are pure open access publishers. It is the most dynamic market segment in academic publishing. We see an annual revenue growth of approximately 13% overall. That's quite down a little bit, and Delta Think forecasts that the revenue growth will further flatten over the next few years. The interesting thing, which I want to come back to later, is that there are nations with significant research output that are coordinating increasingly well. I've already asked the question earlier, but let's come to that back later. So obviously, there have been a lot of discussions on open access, not only in the last 2 days, but also in the last 20 years, I would say. Open access by now is a dominant phenomenon in scholarly publishing. There's no doubt about that. It seems right now that the trend of proliferating digital access and budget pressure, and Anne has spoken about that already, seem to support the model. So it seems to be really supportive at this point from what I'm seeing. Publishers are, to my surprise, frankly, all publishers are now very open to experimenting. And by that, I don't mean offering open access only, but also twisting and tweaking their business models when it's needed at the demand of larger funders, groups of funders, and also institutions and researchers. Their motivation is obviously to either secure or conquer market share in the journals and also in the book space. And saying that without any kind of negative implication, I think that's completely legitimate. Despite the nature that I see in open access, which I see really as a service model, much more than a content model, traditional intermediaries, in my view, have been largely inactive. And that is really a phenomenon to me, that those out there in the space that have done a great deal of work and refer to that as well in organizing scholarly communication, and especially the consumption side of scholarly content, they have been largely inactive when it came to open access. And that is only changing in the last, I would say, a few months, probably a year, where there's an increased activity on some of the intermediaries and the agents. It seems that librarians and libraries are well placed to expand their roles as information specialists on campus. In my view, that was all but clear in the beginning of open access, but it's despite different pockets of open access in institutions, it seems pretty clear that there are more and more librarians keeping or taking control of open access when it comes to organizing it on campus. And obviously, funders are eager to close the conceptual gaps that are still there. And by that, I mean initiatives like Coalition S and Project Deal in Germany and other ones, where you can see that funders are really trying to close the gaps which are out there. An element which is a little bit worrisome, I guess, is the fact that business model innovation is really not something that seems to be limited at this point. So obviously, we are still in a relatively early stage when it comes to the innovation, the innovative nature of the business models. But at the same time, we see already flattening growth. So there seems to be already transformation basically from the growth stage into the stage of maturity in open access. So I'm sure you are all aware of subscribe to open models, APC and book processing charges, BPC models, collective action models of different kinds, read and publish, publish and read, pure publish, and whatever models, different colors of open access and repositories, which I think are especially right now under pandemic conditions, if you want, seeing a special attention from many. Many experiments are being done. I mentioned that earlier. I think a potential disadvantage, not only for publishers, but also for researchers and for funders and libraries, is the fact that many of them are not scalable. So it seems that we are reaching pretty soon after the top 3 publishers or a specific topical niche, we are reaching a point where an expansion of the model beyond that niche or group of publishers is difficult and hence not being followed up by many. There are clearly 3 camps of publishers out there. I think the pure open access publishers are obviously very much in favor of what's going on, and they are also the most innovative ones when it comes to testing out different models. Mixed model publishers, to a certain degree, suffer from the fact that they have infrastructures, cost structures, and also organizations that continue to support also paywalled publications, and that is all but easy. And then there are a few, well, not so much publishers, but rather specific journals and pockets which are avoiding open access to a larger extent. There are obviously differences between books and journals, but we have discussed that to a larger extent already. It's interesting that for many publishers, the heritage, as I called it here, influences their strategies, which is really completely understandable. So obviously the inner organizational change that is needed in the move from a paywall publisher to an open access publisher is significant and means a lot of change. And I think the very interesting question is, what is exactly the point that makes the needle move? So how do publishers get to the threshold that they potentially give up on paywalled content and move 100% to open access? And that's something that I want to look at. What we are seeing right now, and I'm referring here to Springer Nature's term of APCs in the wild. You probably all know the white paper, otherwise you will find the DOI down there. There is a lot of wilderness. I'm not so sure whether there is still a gold rush situation. That has been, I think, the case for quite a number of publishers in the past. But we see that it's getting more and more difficult to really understand the different models, weight and balance them, and at the same time organize them, which is obviously a significant challenge for librarians in their day-to-day work. And I will come back to that in a minute. So talking about the 4 gaps, I see 4 gaps, which are a geopolitical one, as I called it, and I don't want to go into politics, obviously, also not into geopolitics, a relationship issue, an analytics issue, and an organizational gap in many institutions. So let's have a look and go into them. Dirk shared the share of open access by color already yesterday, which you see on the right-hand side. And if you look at the left-hand side, you see the number of articles published both in 2018 or 2009 to 2018. And you can see that the biggest contributors, the biggest nations contributing to to publishing, China, the United States, and India, are pretty far down when it comes to open access penetration. So there is a relatively small share in these markets. That's also true for Germany and Japan. The United Kingdom is an exception, probably to the very early support and organizing function of what is UKRI today and other initiatives. But all in all, we can see that the top contributors when it comes to research output in articles are not really the top supporters of open access. And that means by basically no color. And I think that is not only true for the research output, but also if you look at usage figures, also the top consumers don't pay proportionally. And you are all aware, I think, of those numbers. Consequently, there cannot be a real burden sharing at this point in time in open access on a global scale. There are obviously very different colors. You have seen that in the last chart on the different colors of open access. It's often quoted that that is a cultural difference about sharing and ownership, and referred to access compared to ownership earlier. And I think that's probably also something that we are seeing here. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that there is quite a significant and remarkable progress in international coordination of consortia and also of large library systems and other groups. In my view, the distribution issue is also one that you see on almost all national scales. So the advanced library systems that have quite some adoption open access, like the US, in some respects, the UK, the Netherlands, probably also Germany, are only starting now to tackle the issue of the redistribution of cost. And if you look at the conversations in Germany around Project Deal, for example, you can see that it all circles around the question of how research-intensive libraries in the future will have to carry the burden of publications once the deal structure has been flipped from read to publish. The autonomy of institutions and, by the way, also the autonomy of structures, geographical structures smaller than the state, limits the ability to establish a central governance structure. You are probably aware that for good historical reasons in Germany we have, and in many other countries, and mentioned that about the US as well, we have a very decentral structure in research and education, and that is something which is not really helpful in a situation where you have to redistribute cost and benefits in a new system. because frankly, it has never been a fair distribution of cost and benefits in the past. And the change of the system doesn't really make it easier because obviously there is no real greenfield approach. Most librarians around the world expect budget constraints after COVID to pose additional and disproportional limitations on institutions. So they are not all equal across institutions, but they are being unequal, and that will be supplemented by additional challenges. Looking, for example, at the United Kingdom right now with the Brexit coming up, a lot of people are expecting that these budget constraints will put additional stress on the system and will not make it easier to really flip the system from read to publish. On a local scale, so within one institution, it is basically the same situation. So institutions start to cancel paywalled content to the benefit of open access right now. We have already spoken about Iowa State, which made the headlines last year about canceling a large subscription package and reinvested this money into open access. There is obviously a new source of conflicts within institutions in redistributing the funding. I just had a conversation yesterday with a librarian who told me that he finds it most difficult that most of the money he spends on open access goes into STM, while most members of the publication committee are from the HSS disciplines. So he tries to kind of find a way to balance the different interests within his institution, and you can imagine how difficult that is and probably make that experience in your own work. And then there's also an additional element which I think has not gotten enough attention, which is research funding industry, for example, the pharma industry, and also companies in engineering, for example, car makers. You know that we are obsessed with car making in Germany, but I guess there are also other countries like that. So it seems to be difficult at this point to involve industry. And even if you look at their commitments they are making to support open access, for example, groups like Open Pharma, it still is in a number of cases simply a metadata issue to detect, discover, and work with the funding that the pharma industry may be willing to provide in the publication process of open access. An interesting observation, and I think Dirk pointed to it yesterday already, is that there is very little numbers being used and analytics being used when making decisions on open access. So right now, we already have cost data, usage data as well for longer periods of time available. There are only a few institutions, as far as I know, that correlate APC spendings or PAR fees with usage or any kind of other impact measurement which is out there. Right now, it seems, oops, I've missed a word there, that the decision-making round about transformative agreements really is driven by number of agreements. So there is a kind of as much as you can eat approach for many institutions. If you talk to librarians and ask them about their open access activity, I'm hearing quite often that they have X number of transformative agreements in place. There are first analyses indicating that large corpora of journals, not only on the read side, but also on the publishing side, are not really being used. So I've put down a DOI there into the sources, and that's also a study that has been conducted by Dirk Pieper and a colleague last year, that 20% of a Springer Compact deal, for example, in 20% of those journals have not been used for publications. And I've also put in the website for UNSUB, which I'm sure you are all aware of, which is being heavily used at this point in time of budget pressure. I would assume that librarians will look more into tools to help analyze what is really helpful to have in their portfolios and what not, because there's always a kind of indirect funding structure behind this. It seems to me that, and we've learned that from Ben yesterday as well, that publishers should look at tools to strengthen their communities or any communities that are on their portfolios, not around journals or book series, but really communities of research to make sure that they have a better understanding, and we will come back to that in a minute, a better understanding of that activity. Creating structure in a complex world, well, I guess, and I've taken the liberty here to show you OABLE, which is something that we are looking at Knowledge Unlatched right now. What we have been seeing over the last year or so is that there are really no standards in open access, except for probably Creative Commons licenses. But when it comes to deal structures and to publication structures, it's really very difficult to find any kind of structure because of the many-to-many relations on all sides, on the researcher's side, institution side, as well as publisher's sides. Agreements seem to differ substantially by institution and by publisher, and the differentiation seems to increase and not decrease, which we should be seeing in a kind of consolidating or flattening growth curve at a certain point as in a maturing market. And at the same time, there are still different responsibilities in institutions for open access. So libraries are involved, scholarly communication officers are, departments are in many cases, the VPs for research are involved, and so on. So it's really difficult for everybody involved to find the right person to talk about the issues which are out there. It seems to me that volume growth and limited resources really increase the pressure in libraries on this. So I've spoken to a number of librarians who have told me that they are under significant pressure to hire more staff to look after open access, first of all, and also more and more running into a situation where open access budgets, APC budgets and other ones are being used up way before the end of the fiscal year, which always brings them into situations which are really uncomfortable to explain researchers that their gold open access article can't be funded anymore because simply the budget is being used up. Smaller publishers, we saw that yesterday from Johannes Ruck's, sorry, I'm always with Joachim, Johannes Ruck's comments. Smaller publishers are impacted most, and I call that the project deal effect here in Germany. It's always, and it's understandably always, like looking at publishers from the top down, and that makes it obviously difficult for smaller publishers to make their voices heard in a situation where a lot of business models are being switched. Several consortia are actively working to create a level playing field. I think that's also important to say. So these small publishers are not being left alone. I've been looking at the UK over the last half year for a project quite extensively. And there are initiatives that are really trying to make sure that smaller publishers, society publishers particularly, or academic-led presses are not being kind of pushed out of the market. That is a difficult challenge for everybody involved right now. But I think it's important to mention that libraries are not in a situation where they simply don't care, but where they are trying to balance off to a certain degree the focus that they, for economic reasons, have to have on the top 3 publishers or top 5 publishers. It seems to me that technology can really help us to alleviate the burden that is out there, the increasing volume and the limited resources, but it also puts a spotlight on the industry-wide issues which we all know about, but which are still unresolved. That is metadata quality, the interoperability of systems. Publishing, academic publishing runs right now on a lot of pretty outdated infrastructures, and that makes it really difficult to exchange vital metadata. And I think as an industry, we have to work on that, and publishers are well advised to really invest into this field, and librarians are, I think, really well advised to ask for this and push publishers into this direction. I mentioned community, and for me, the rediscovery of the researcher is one very important element. I think academic publishers have lost touch and have focused heavily on library and industry sales over the last 15 or 20 years, I would say. Researchers are hardly perceived as prosumers, the ones that are producing and consuming. And by that, I don't mean that we are not philosophically supporting that, but by that, I mean that there is very, very limited systems and resources that are really supporting this view, a holistic view of the researcher as, well, basically a very significant decision maker in scholarly publishing. In my view, the pandemic will have a lasting effect, a ripple effect on academic conferences. I think we have all seen that even though we prefer to meet in person, and we would probably all have preferred to meet in New York City today, we see that balancing our travel burden, our travel budgets, and our need for personal interaction, there might be a very different situation also after this pandemic, when we can all hopefully travel again soon, which means that networks like ResearchGate, which you see on the right-hand side, are, in my view, clearly a very important tool in the future. I think the ingredients for success for publishers, for libraries, by the way, as well, and also for suppliers like ResearchGate, are a dense network of people. Obviously, it's about scale. It is about content. And in my view, it's about tools and services that are connected to the first two elements. Where do we go from here? I'm trying to be a little bit quicker than I promised, at least 3 minutes. I've tried 8 hypotheses, and I'm happy to discuss them with you. And a negative one, if you want, which is a positive one on the right-hand side, which is the war is over. So I think there is not so much of a kind of ideological battle anymore, as we have seen that in open access for quite a while. And I think that's always a good thing to see. Battles, war is never a good analogy, I think. And I think it's really good to see that there are different positions on certain thesis, on certain perspectives, but that the space is really coming together to resolve the problems in the interest of researchers. So obviously we have to live with a situation right now where the very wild gold rush, the exponential growth phase in open access for some publishers is over. And I think there might be some extra effects from the pandemic right now, but I guess we'll see a flattening growth curve. And that is the new reality, in my view, in that field. There's a new focus on problem solving. It's not an ideological question anymore whether publishers support open access, do open access or not. It's really a question how to do it best, at least in 95% of the cases. And I think that is a very welcome development. Issues can only be resolved collaboratively. That's something that we are telling ourselves all the time. But in my view, that really means data have to be interoperable. Nobody owns data and nobody should sit on data and not share them. But we need to find ways to make the system, the ecosystem really work in a way that we are also exchanging data to guarantee the flow of information and of publications. Coordination is needed, and that is a claim to the library side. Initiatives need broader adoption. It is important for publishers to see that libraries are continuously supporting open access. I think we see that in a lot of organizations already, but we are still a little bit away from a situation compared to large publisher packages, which have seen a great support over the last 2 or 3 decades. It's now time to really make sure that open science and open access get reliable funding and reliable support. I already mentioned the metadata quality and the interoperability. I can't focus on that enough. I think academic publishing has to go all digital. And by that, I don't mean move from a PDF to an XML, but I really mean focusing on metadata and obviously content data quality to really make sure that publications are out as quickly as possible and are as interconnected in the world as possible in the interest of research. I mentioned UNSUB and other models. Even though all-in models help to simplify, I think business-wise, they are not a long-term solution for libraries. I think librarians realize that replacing one big deal with the other big deal is obviously not in their interest. So I think publishers should really focus in their business models as well, in their content models, on pick and choose solutions wherever they are possible, and not just focus on potentially large deals. Researcher communities are gaining importance. I have mentioned that already, and I would like to reiterate that I think it's really important to not just connect content and make that interoperable, but also to connect people, researchers behind the content with each other and also to their content. And I think that can be a very powerful force also to involve people who are not already in the circles of certain disciplines by making sure that it's easy to get into those networks and lower the barriers of access, both within a given academic system, but also beyond that. Think of the global south. It's not just about consuming research. It's also about contributing to research and working directly with researchers. And last but not least, I think we need a better understanding of how to involve industry, research-heavy industry, to get included and involved with open access. In my experience, there is a great preparedness to really work with academic institutions and also with researchers on open access and open science. Let's not assume that they are all obsessed with protecting copyright or patented information or whatever. There's a lot of information that these companies are willing to share and also to financially support open access. And I think it's really important to have a fresh look also at that little war and the claims that we have seen there in the past and get them involved. Well, that's already it. Thank you very much for your attention, for listening, and I'll switch off. Now I'm challenged here with all of this. I'm switching off the charts, and I am happy to take questions. Joachim, do you want me to do this myself, or how shall we go?
Well, I can pass some of the questions on to you. Helen asks, she would be interested to know if libraries are willing to pay for publishing of content rather than access to content, or are they supporting this model because it's the least worst option?
Well, I guess that's a good question, and I think from what I see, there is obviously different libraries out there. I think there's not one single answer, but my view is yes, there are certain institutions who are willing to pay for publishing. In my view, whenever you access a library and talk to them about open access, there's very quickly the question of both sides of the medal, the publishing side, but also the reading side, basically. So I think that's probably the difficulty in open access, in trying to promote it, that a lot of people are interested in both sides, and you need a very close match to convince libraries in supporting open access.
Okay, there's a comment, I think, from Jody. She says, war is over, but now we are at the point of logistics of withdrawing the troops and determining actions moving forward.
I completely agree.
Yeah, okay.
I completely agree. I think it is really a logistics question, and I think that's a mere consequence of volume, first of all, but it's also probably a situation when I participated in a conference on Subscribe to Open. When was that? Last year? I think last year, no, the year before at MIT, people were talking about an open access fatigue. I'm not so sure whether there is still an open access fatigue, but in my view, it is indeed now a question of logistics and making sure that we make the most of it and make it as easy as possible.
Yeah. And says, this seemed like a sobering presentation about the future of open access, that is slow-moving uptake. She's asking whether she did understand correctly.
Well, and I'm probably known to be sober at this time of the day, but jokes aside, I would say that I think most people would have expected more from open access after 20 years. And I think we could have done better. That doesn't mean that it is not time to change, but I think indeed that there is a need to put the money and put the effort where the mouth is. And so I think it's really important for all of us to see how far we want to basically push this, if it is really something that helps researchers in their daily work. And then I think it's time for a concerted effort to really push open access further.
Okay, question coming from Catherine. She says that she convinced the library director to participate in an open access pledging from Knowledge Unlatched in Germany. And the question is, how easily do you find participation from libraries in the pledgings?
That's a good question. I think we are every year at Knowledge Unlatched trying to basically fine-tune our approach. We see that the support is expanding. So also this year, we see more support coming in despite the difficult economic times for many libraries. And that's really gratifying, as you can imagine, going out to libraries and still getting a yes instead of a no in many cases. Even though you know that they are under financial constraints. I think the balance is that on the one hand, we are in a maturing segment right now, so we need to offer choice, which means it's more and more difficult to convene enough libraries around specific pieces of content or packages or whatever you want to call it. So I think it's never easy, but obviously it's more easy than to be in the paywalled world, I would say. So in that case, I'm happy to answer the question whether we get a yes. The question is from Jody, did we get to a yes? I don't know the library that Catherine is talking about, but indeed, I mean, it is a situation which is an ongoing struggle, but it's gratifying because we see a lot of people supporting KU, and by the way, also other initiatives. I'm far away from just promoting KU here. It's really important that it's a broad field which is going forward.
Okay, Tiberius comes in with a question or an argument. He argues that advocating and practicing OA should come with the responsibility of educating the public how to use the research literature. The scientific jargon could be easily misinterpreted and associated with the perceived authority of researchers. It could help the disinformation. If you agree, who is best positioned to take such responsibility?
Tiberius, I do agree, and I think there are a few initiatives underway that I've seen already 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. I think it's really important to think twice. First of all, what are the most evident and most likely areas to go into, and to have kind of layman versions and those versions that should be available to a broader audience. I see clearly a publisher responsibility here. I think it makes sense for publishers to enter into that field because it is a highly important translational job basically to be done, and publishers have always been good at that. There are initiatives right now who are working on that, and I know a number of publishers. I also know that there have been experiments, if I remember correctly, at the Max Planck Society, for example, in trying to explain normal people like you and me what this is all about, COVID or whatever. And I think then the question is also the medium. Is it an article? Is it a blog post? Or can it be a video like for example, Latest Thinking? Can it be a podcast? So I think there are different initiatives, and we should really look into how to not only communicate in words, but also technically best to general audiences.
Okay, at the moment, there are no further questions. Anybody? Yeah. Lavinia says transformative agreements have a time frame attached to it. Will the flipping of journals really happen as soon as some hope? Or do you think there will be some kind of stagnation?
Well, I think that's an interesting question because that's what I meant with the with alluding in one of the headlines to what makes the needle move. I think when I spoke to a number of publishers and I asked them, so what makes the needle move for you guys? What has to happen that you flip a journal completely from subscription to open access? There was no clear answer. And I think that's something that we would probably have to discuss further. Like, is it a certain revenue share of open access? Is it a certain number of article share? So I think it is critical that there are transformative agreements, and the ones that I've seen and that the ones that I've read don't really give me a better understanding of what the end game is. I understand the process. I understand that they're making the first steps, and that's all fair enough. But what is really the end game, and what are the steps that need to be taken to completely flip? I think it will be really difficult to do that, and it will be interesting in 2022, for example, in Germany, when the first transformative agreement with Project Deal is up for renewal with Wiley. It will be interesting to see how this transformational element is being done. And I think, I'm not sure whether anybody has an idea about that yet.
Okay, two further questions coming in. Jody, for subscribe to open, do you feel like all libraries need to contribute no matter the amount, or is it better than a few contribute a lot?
Yeah, Jody, very interesting question. I think it doesn't help to just transform from subscription to subscribe to open by keeping everything as it was before. So that's obviously not helpful. If there could be a kind of division of labor for those institutions that feel a specific discipline, whether it's water research or political science or anthropology or whatever it might be, that those institutions that have a very strong vested interest should really invest more. And I understand that between supporting open access books and journals, libraries have a very different view on the world. So I've seen in the conversations that I've had on journals that the economic thinking is very strong. So kind of cost benefit, and we don't want to spend more than we have spent so far. So in that respect, also subscribe to open is, I think, a tool that makes it easy for everybody to participate, both publishers and librarians. But I think it can't be the last word on open access transformation.
Thanks. Richard Jarkin has put on an interesting question, I think. He says, I understand why open access is popular. Free and fast communication in science is vital. Do you think that most working scientists care about it as much as we do?
Richard, no, not at all. I think most researchers don't care at all, and that's good because they should do research. I think this is very much a professionalist debate between publishers and librarians, and a few researchers, admittedly. So it's not without researchers, fortunately. But I think it is indeed a question of how to fund the cost of research publications. Obviously, in my personal view, we will never reach researchers to a certain beyond a certain degree, basically, with this type of discussion. And the question really is whether we should bother them with this at all. I think you don't have to really understand each and every detail as long as there are professionals in the field that enable you to work in a certain network. I think that's differently if you work as a researcher in something like ResearchGate, which I mentioned. But I think for who is funding in which types of deals what, it's not really necessary that every researcher understands.
Philip brings in the perspective of learned societies. He says they continue to depend on income from subscriptions to support their wider objectives. What's the outlook for them? Being small organization, can they benefit from transformative agreements?
I think so. And we had this conversation briefly yesterday with Johannes, now I'm getting it right, Johannes Rux, which was on the idea whether these smaller publishers could probably team up. I'm not sure whether every publisher always needs to reinvent the wheel. And let me be a little bit pushy on this, but I think that the smaller the publisher, the higher the creativity, and that doesn't really help. If you look at larger publishers, the creativity is limited by commercial people very soon. So I think looking at this and really saying, let's put together a group of 20, 30, whatever publishers, and then negotiate with the big guys on the library side, that might be really helpful and be a kind of facilitator on both ends, on the publisher side, but also on the library side, because it would just give us more time to really invest into the negotiation and setting the standards. So I think there is a future for scholarly publishing with learned societies, but I think doing it in a solitary way alone is probably not the right way to do it.
Okay, at the moment we don't have any further questions. If nothing is coming in, I would like to thank Sven very much for that very interesting talk, and also for the interesting discussion that was triggered.